Thanks, guys. It's good to be back to Penn. I was a visitor here in 2017 in Kostas's lab. Is the sound okay? Everybody can hear? Yeah. Yeah, so it's good to be back. Glad to be here. Glad to be talking about some of the research that we've been recently doing during my postdoc in the direction of building open source generalist robot policies. And I want to start kind of trying to set up the scene a little bit and trying to explain a little bit what the goal is really of that research direction. And then we can talk about all the pieces that we're putting in place towards that goal. So I think the motivating example here does not come from robotics. It really comes from NLP. I think NLP is a field, hey Kostas, that has recently undergone a pretty big paradigm shift, right? Where in the past, people would train individual models on individual tasks, get some performance with them. But then more recently, maybe like 2-3 years ago, most of the field in NLP shifted towards a paradigm where you take big pre-trained models from the cloud, either through an API or through some actual weights that you can download. You maybe sprinkle on a little bit of your own data for whatever task you care. It may be in context, it may be fine-tuning. And then you get a model that can do a lot of different tasks, right? Like not just one, but it can actually do most of them. And it turns out that it can do most of them better than if you had started training a model only on that task. Okay, so this move towards more foundational models has really paid off in this field. Same for computer vision. Now, the goal of the research that I want to present today is really to do something quite similar in robotics and change the way that we're doing robotic research towards a paradigm that looks more like what I just presented. So kind of the idea would be to have some model pre-trained in the cloud, what we would then call a robot foundation model. You may sprinkle on some of your own data if you need to. From the target domain that you care or the kind of task that you care about. And then ideally, you would want a model that can basically do a similar thing where it can control many robots, do many tasks, and actually help those robots perform those tasks better than if you had just trained on the original data set. All right, so this is kind of the goal. And when I say generalist robot policy, I really mean that thing in the middle here, which is some policy that has been pre-trained on a lot of robot data, diverse robots, diverse scenes and tasks, and helps you better solve downstream tasks on the kind of robot setups that you care about. Okay, and most of the research that I will discuss today is really trying to build things like this. And I will not claim that we have already succeeded at building them, but I want to kind of show you the steps that we have taken in that direction and what kind of resources exist today so that you could also help work towards this goal. All right, I think to start this off, it's very helpful to think about specifically how the robot learning problem is different from the NLP problem, right? Like, why can't we just apply the exact same recipe that has worked in NLP and that has worked in vision and just apply it to robots and, success? And I think there's really two big things that made this recipe work in NLP and vision. One is large data sets, right? Like these guys, they can crawl the internet, just scrape the data from there, clean it sufficiently. This is where most of the magic happens. But then they have very nice, expressive, diverse data sets. And then on the other hand, there's large models. I think it's no secret that basically the transformer model has been instrumental to the success, fitting large data sets very well, scaling with compute. These are kind of the key ingredients that made it work in NLP. So how is robotics different, right? Like what is different in the robotics problem that we can't just do the literal same thing? On the one hand, I think on the data side, it's pretty clear to all of us that robotics does not have the same luxury of having wide, nice, diverse data sets readily available on the internet because people don't usually upload this kind of data to the internet. So robotics data is particularly scarce, right? Like we can't just scrape it from the internet, and collecting new data is particularly tedious. It involves usually dragging some robot to some new environment, paying a teleoperator or doing it yourself to get that new data sample. And then it doesn't scale as nicely as just scraping the internet. So data is a really big issue in robotics. And I will talk about a few works today where we have tried to alleviate the data bottleneck a little bit. On the model side, I think there's some problems that clearly make robotics different. On the one hand, it's definitely a multimodal problem, right? Like usually we don't just operate in language space. We want to perceive the world. We may have sensors that are not just cameras. They may be force torque. Or other types of sensors, 3D sensors, and so on. And the problem is also very heterogeneous. And with heterogeneous here, I mean that the different robot setups that we usually work with look very different, right? They may have different morphologies, they have different sensory suites, different action spaces, and so on. So models that we develop need to be flexible enough to kind of capture this wide diversity of the robotics problem. And I will talk a little bit about the kind of modeling steps that we took in that direction. There's a few other factors. Usually in robotics, we care a lot about continuous values. Language is fundamentally discrete, so maybe we need to have slightly different architectural choices to make that easier. And then another point that we care about in robotics often is kind of real time and being fast. We don't have really the luxury of waiting for our GPT API to compute for a minute before we take the next action. So I think there's a few more constraints here. I'm not saying that NLP people don't care about speed, but robotics people may need to care a little bit more. Okay, and so in the later part of this talk, I will discuss a few modeling works that we have done that try to address some of these points. Cool. Then let's try to dive in. I will start on the data side, and I will start with a larger project that we've done in the fall of last year. It's called the Open X-Embodiment project. And the goal here was really to basically try to address this data bottleneck in robotics, at least to some extent. And the key idea when we started this project, this was a huge collaboration, and it was led by Quan Vuong, who was a research scientist at Google, used to be. He led this effort at Google. I helped him organize it, and we tried to really get to a large, diverse robot data set. Right? And so one way you can do this is to collect a lot of data. This is a hard way, and we will discuss that a little bit later. The key insight in this project is that there already kind of was quite a few robotic data sets. Right? So at the time when we did this project, there were a few robot learning papers people had worked on where they had designed and collected some of these data sets. These were quite large data sets. They were usually not very compatible with each other, so people wouldn't like train on all of them. They would maybe train on one, evaluate in that setting. But kind of the key point in this project is that there's actually a lot more robot data. It's just not as easily available. So if you think about it, every lab that works on robot learning necessarily needs to collect data, right? Like all of our experiments require some sort of data set. And so I'm sure many of you guys in your research have also collected data sets. Just usually because they're kind of small and they're somewhat specific to the setting that we're working in, we don't really think about uploading those, right? Or making them available. And even if we do, then, on the user side of that data set, it's, sometimes a little bit annoying to like, oh, I need to parse yet another data set. And is it really worth the overhead, given that it's only on the small domain? And so the key insight in this project was that if we kind of go do that effort for the community and basically try to aggregate existing data sets, bring them into a format that makes it very easy for people to use, then these kind of many small pieces together can form a much more useful, bigger picture. And so what we did here is literally we went out, we asked our friends, what data do you have? Would you be willing to contribute? And then we tried to make them very easy to interoperate and use with each other. And this is what then forms the Open X-Embodiment dataset. There's two main benefits to this. One is scale. So as I mentioned, we didn't actually collect any data for this project. We only aggregated existing data sets, which allowed us to very quickly kind of increase the number of data sets. So within like a project time frame of 4 months, we were able to aggregate 60 existing robot learning data sets. If we tried to collect that same amount of data, I think it would have taken much, much longer. And I think scale is not the only aspect here. The other is diversity, because by aggregating data sets from the community, we kind of implicitly make sure that the data we end up in the end has all the kinds of diversity that the community cares about, right? So there may be some researchers that really care about tactile sensing or soft object manipulation, dexterous tasks or long horizon tasks, things like this. And so in their research, they will have collected data for these problems, right? Because that's what they want to work on. And so by aggregating these data sets, we end up with a final kind of combined data set that captures many of these problems that people are interested in. Not each trajectory in the data set will be long horizon or soft object manipulation, but at least some aspect of the data set will cover it. All right, so long story short, we collected this data set, we aggregated this data set really. The final cross-embodiment data set is at time the largest robot manipulation data set, has more than 1 million episodes, mostly real robot. It has 22 robot embodiments, so you can see it's really diverse. It's not just like one robot doing all the different tasks. 34 research labs involved, so it was quite a big organizational overhead. And in the end, more than 300 scenes. So quite a bit more diverse than any of the robot data sets that existed prior by definition, because we aggregated most of the existing data sets. Okay. I won't go into like too much detail of what is in the data set. There is some viewers online where you can actually browse the data set yourself. But broadly speaking, we have basically many environments. We try to many embodiments, many different types of robots. We try to cover a diverse range of scenes, indoor and outdoor, mostly indoor, to be fair. And we have a diverse range of skills. So it's not all pick and place. There's like a bunch of interesting soft body manipulation things. There's like long horizon tasks. This is, I think, from my lab at USC. We try to do this like furniture assembly. So there's a lot of diversity in this data set, and it's a new type of data set that has its own types of challenges. Cool. In the paper, I encourage you to look at it. We did a lot more analysis on like what robots are in there, what fraction do they represent, what tasks have we looked at, and then what kind of objects do the different trajectories feature. But broadly speaking, it's a bit more diverse than anything that has been there before. And so hopefully by training on a data set like this, we would actually be able to show, some sort of meaningful transfer. All right. We have made this all fairly easy to use. If you guys haven't checked it out or haven't used it yet, I highly encourage you. We have these spreadsheets where you have all the metadata about the individual data sets. We made it all into a coherent format called RLDS, which is like a TensorFlow dataset format. It does not work only with TensorFlow. You can use it with PyTorch, you can use it with JAX. It is fairly easy to get started. We have some collabs for you to try out. We also provide filtering mechanisms. So if you say, oh, I have a panda robot, so I only want panda data, you can very easily basically subset the data set and only download the ones that are relevant for your research. Okay, so we really try to make it hopefully easy enough to use, and I highly encourage you guys to check it out. Let me know if something doesn't work well. We're still trying to improve it. And it's also still an ongoing effort. So we're onboarding more and more data sets and trying to grow the overall size. Cool. So I've talked about the data. In the project, we also did some modeling experiments. Basically, it's not enough to just put out a data set. You kind of need to show that it's useful for something. And so the experiments there were actually very simple. We basically took existing models that existed within Google, the RT series, robotics transformers. There's RT1 model, which is basically just a vanilla transformer. And RT2 is kind of a VLM-style pre-trained model that you fine-tune for actions. And so we took those models, 0 changes, and we just changed the data distribution that we train on to this cross-embodied data set that we aggregated, and then tried to compare. Basically, does this actually help the models to train on more robot embodiments and richer robot data? Okay, and this is kind of an interesting aspect of this project. It's not just the data collection, it's also the evaluation side. So you can imagine if you train these models on diverse robot data sets, you also kind of need to evaluate them on diverse robot data sets or robot scenarios. And so here the evaluation was actually distributed across many, many time zones and researchers and students who did these evaluations. And this was a kind of an interesting aspect that was also new to me, that you need to like coordinate evaluations across labs because the different setups exist not in one lab, but many. Yeah, so we tested on a bunch of different robots. The key result here is that we basically compared to, in the respective lab, the best baseline that they had trained before on whatever task they had contributed to the data set. Then our RT-1X model for this plot trained only on their data. So this is basically the kind of the modeling ablation. So we make sure the model is not the only reason that this thing works better. And then in rainbow colors is basically the model, the same RT-1X model trained on the full cross-embodiment data set. Oh, well, not the full, but like a subset of, let's say, 11, I think, of the data sets that we had early on, because at some point we need to like stop adding data sets to the modeling side. Yeah, and so like overall, you can basically see that the general trend holds, that the model isn't really making the big difference, but then the data set and the code training actually does help improve the modeling performance. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what, so the Autolab example is this UR5 robot. I think it's this one. It's a tabletop wiping task. So it's a fairly small data set as part of the full mixture. So I would assume it's also not like super heavily represented in the mixed in the final data mix that we trained on. So it is possible that it may have suffered from not properly fitting that data set. Yeah, so this is not 5 models trained on 5 tasks, but this is 1 model trained on the full data mix and then evaluated in 5 tasks. So there may be some performance decrease on some. All right. I also want to talk about the second result here. So this is the RT-1X model, the vanilla transformer. The RT-2X model is trained on the VLM base. And this was actually maybe the slightly more interesting result in my mind, because you could imagine that if you have a model that's already trained on the internet, it may not actually benefit a whole lot from training on, a few more robot data sets, because the added diversity of those robot data sets is much, much smaller than the kind of diversity that you would get already from the internet pre-training. But so what we did here is that we kind of picked a few tasks where we knew that the original RT2 model wasn't particularly good. So those are tasks that are more requiring more fine-grained spatial grounding kind of problems. So for example, like putting something on the cloth versus next to the cloth, or putting it in the top right corner versus the bottom right corner. So things where you would expect that maybe a model that was trained on VQA only wouldn't be particularly good, because VQA doesn't usually require these like very fine-grained spatial reasoning steps. And so on these kind of tasks, we actually saw that the co-training with these other robotics data sets that require more fine-grained spatial understanding of the scenes actually did improve the performance meaningfully. Whereas maybe on some of the more standard evaluation tasks, it didn't have a particularly big dent.
Overall, they are not defined by, the tasks are not defined by language, right? Then my user opening is not defined by language.
All the tasks that we tested on are language conditioned. It may just be that a language is not particularly inventive. Like the door opening probably just says open the door for all the tasks, or for all the sequences. So all of the models that we tested were always like single image in, language instruction in, and then action out.
So there was no task where the task is to have an end image? Like
No. Very good question though, because the next model I want to talk about will have that capability. Great. So yeah, overall, basically, we saw some signs of life, that there is positive transfer from co-training on all these other data sets, even if they have diverse robot embodiments, very different scenes, and so on. They seem to have some signs of transfer. All right. Maybe I will briefly stop to see if there's any questions about the open cross-embodiment data set. I will also take questions at the end, but if there's something burning.
Why do you need to do co-training?
What do you mean? So we could pre-train on.
Just like only fine-tune on the test. Because you mentioned you have to like co-train, like train with both the original training data and like the domain that like the
So here we're actually not doing any, let's say, fine-tuning setting. We're basically just once training a model on all the data sets combined, right? And so this is kind of the, let's say, cleanest setting, because you don't do anything specific for any domain, but you get one foundational model that should be able to do all of them. Yeah. Cool. So we kind of covered the dataset side a little bit, right? We now have a reasonably large, at least for robotic standards, dataset with some diversity. And so now I want to talk a little bit more about a modeling project where we try to exactly push the capabilities of the models that we're building to be a bit more flexible and be a bit more towards these points that I mentioned in the beginning. And so I think one key point that I mentioned is that robot datasets are heterogeneous. And to kind of visualize this point, I went around our floor at Berkeley and tried to take photos of all the different robot setups that I could find there, robot arms, to be fair. And you can see that they already look super diverse, right? And it's not just the robot itself. It's the scene that it's in, but it's also the kind of sensors, the control stack, like all of these things are super different. Right, and this is one floor in one building, one university. So you can imagine that the kind of heterogeneity and diversity of robot learning data setups or robot learning control setups is super, super large. And so building models that can handle this diversity of sensory inputs, diversity of actuations, action spaces, and also, not to neglect this, compute budgets, I think is a kind of key question that we need to solve in robot learning. And I want to discuss one project that we made in this direction. On the compute budget side, specifically, the previous project trained these large models, but there was no way for people to kind of use them other than zero shot. Like you just needed to run it, but most likely it wouldn't work on your task. So really, we want to focus a little bit more on the kind of how to adapt the model quickly to a new task. Okay, so this second project I want to discuss is called the Octo project. It's our first kind of foray into building these more open source generalist robot policies. It's a big collaboration project again, lots of PhD students involved from Sergey's lab, Chelsea's lab, some CMU collaborators, where we try to build this first kind of fully open source training pipeline for these generalist robot policies. Okay. As before, we kind of needed to evaluate in a quite diverse setting here, many different robots involved. The key facts of the Octo model is that it's, again, a multi-robot control model. Importantly, it's more flexible in its observation and action spaces than the original RT1 and 2X models. And I will discuss what this means. And it is fully open source. So not just the model weights or the inference, but also the full training pipeline, the data loader, our visualization code, like anything that you would need to get started on training these models, it's fully open source. And finally, we have trained this on a larger mixture than the original RT1 dataset because we spent more time going through all the datasets and making sure that we can kind of co-train on them. All right. For today's talk, I mainly want to focus on the kind of design decisions that we made when designing this model and kind of walk you through our reasoning for why we made certain choices. And maybe also discuss a little bit what worked and what didn't. So I think there were 4 key things that we cared about. One, we wanted the architecture to be as simple and kind of scalable as possible. So ideally, no bells and whistles that are not necessary. We wanted it to be adaptable. So I mentioned there's many different robot setups. They all look different. So we wanted a model that doesn't just like train once and then you need to follow, but that can adapt to the user's requirements. And then we wanted to make it easy to use and also easy to extend. We basically wanted to give people kind of a code base that they could then build their own research upon. All right, so let's look into these points a little bit more. On the architecture side, the Octo transformer is basically a fairly straightforward transformer model, as you would imagine. So it has a language encoder. That thing is pre-trained and frozen, and essentially tokenizes your language inputs. And then it has an observation tokenizer that takes care of image style inputs, both current observation and also goal observations. Just like patchifies them, runs them through a very shallow CNN encoder and gets you these image tokens. And then we just essentially concatenate those and feed them into a large transformer. The thing essentially looks very much like a vanilla vision transformer that we train here. And then we have a decoding head, which in our case is a diffusion decoding head, because we found that diffusion actually works very well for these kind of like continuous values that we're trying to predict in the action space. Okay. Key to this design is that we try to concentrate most of the kind of compute that we invest in this model in this large transformer backbone that can actually attend to all the inputs and task specifications, as opposed to maybe some prior designs that had like these large ResNet style encoders for each image separately and then merged them somewhat later. The code base is scalable. It's all written in JAX, which is efficient, supports multi-node TPU, GPU training. And our current model sizes that we're working with are in the 30 to 100 million parameter scale, which is not, like language model scale, but it's also a bit larger than the existing robot policies. And to give you an idea of the compute, we are basically using a 128 TPU node cluster for roughly a day. Basically, this is the kind of level of compute that we're investing in the larger models in the Octo scale.
Is an action head generates like paths
or? Generates action chunks. That's a good question. So basically, it doesn't generate a single action, but it generates kind of a short chunk of actions, which we can then theoretically execute open loop.
Like waypoints?
It's not really waypoints. It's like end effector position deltas. So it's like 6 degrees of freedom control. And then we use some like low-level, position following controller to actually execute those.
But are they rolled out or just one?
So we're using, I think, in the end, receding horizon control, where we basically predict the chunk every time step, but then average them over temporal distance. Yeah, so these are choices that are very much inspired by the recent like imitation learning methods like ACT or diffusion policy that also found this kind of action chunking to be really helpful. And we found the same, essentially. Cool. So I want to talk a little bit about the adaptability aspect here. So one thing that we really try to make sure is that the model is fine-tunable to new setups that people may have that don't exactly look like the thing that we pre-trained on. Right? Like if you actually look at the Open X-Embodiment dataset and you look what data is there for each dataset, it does not look uniform. Right? Like some datasets have 1 camera, some have 3, some have a wrist camera, some don't, some have a force torque sensor, some don't. So there's a lot of diversity here. And basically our philosophy was that for the pre-training of this model, we try to find a kind of unified setup that captures a reasonable part of this data set. So we have language conditioning and goal conditioning because we thought people may want that. And we have a third-person camera and a wrist camera input. And we're zero padding wrist camera if it doesn't exist. And then we produce these end effector actions. Right? But it may well be that on some data sets or some tasks, people want a force torque sensor. Right? And so we wanted to have a way for people to easily slot in that additional input when they fine-tune the model. Or similarly, they may have a different action head and so on. Yeah, so the way that we designed the Octo model is that we have these kind of blocks of inputs for the task, for the observations. Then we define these readout tokens, which are basically just kind of placeholder tokens that are used to produce embeddings that can then go into the kind of functional heads that we want to produce. And this is a sequential model, so it happens over multiple time steps. And so crucially now, basically, if you have a new input, say you have a 4-stroke reading, at fine-tuning time, you can just insert a few tokens here that capture your new input, and you can fine-tune the model, and you don't need to throw away all the weights before. Similarly, you can change out the action head, or if you have a new kind of head that you want to actually predict, like a new function you want to add to your network. Say, for example, you want to like start predicting values because you want to do RL now. You can essentially just swap in a new readout head, and you can train that readout head, and it will not mess up any of the functionality in the rest of the network that you have trained before. Okay, so the model is kind of made in a way that it's easy for you to take and remove functionality after the pre-training stage, because we assumed that whatever we pre-trained doesn't actually very tightly fit the kind of use cases that people want to use this model for. Yeah, one interesting aspect also is that with the number of these readout tokens, you can kind of allocate compute dynamically. So you can say, oh, I think value prediction is harder than action prediction, so I should allocate more tokens here, which will effectively allocate more compute to this problem, right? Because more flops will be spent on computing these embeddings than some other embeddings. We haven't really experimented with this. It's just like an interesting thing that you can do in these kind of models.
And the input is already some encoder, some embedding, like for vision, is it already like a foundation model, or you do everything inside the...
We do everything inside the model. We basically have a very shallow kind of 3-layer CNN, but nothing is initialized from pre-trained data. We experimented with this a little bit, specifically because our whole network is basically a big VIT. We can kind of initialize the whole thing to basically some like siglib or whatever weights. We haven't experimented a whole lot. In the experiments we tried, it didn't seem to help. There may be like some careful weighting of like how much do you change the weights? Do you fine-tune all of them? Do you do like some low-rank fine-tuning? There may be more exploration to be done. Whatever we tried didn't seem to help, so we didn't end up using it.
At the beginning of the transformer, is it agnostic, for example, to appearance versus positional encoding, or semantics versus positional encoding of the words, or generic, or like receiver IO, let's say, or is it like...
It's not, well, so it's agnostic in the sense that like once it's tokenized, it's all just tokens to the transformer and it will just run on it. Now the way you tokenize the individual modalities is a bit different, right? Like some use pre-trained written language encoders, some use just this like patchifying approach. Yeah, but once it's tokens, it's all tokens, so it like very easily fits in.
Are you encoding the sensor or modality ID somewhere, or you think that's the same purely overhead camera, the side camera?
Yeah, so we don't do this because for our training, it's all kind of fixed. Like always, the first observation slot will be the third-person camera, the second will be the wrist camera. I think there is a version of this model that we should probably build that is more flexible, where you can say, okay, if I don't have a wrist camera, I don't feed it. If I only have a wrist camera, I feed it first, right? And then you would need to like basically prepend kind of a class token or something like this to basically tell the transformer, oh, now comes wrist observation.
Right now, you're just kind of feeding black.
Yeah, yeah. So we are masking the attention on those, so it's like technically not incorrect, but it's, let's say, less efficient, right? Like, for example, if we had a data set that had 5 cameras and we decided to co-train, it would mean that we would need to pad all the data sets to 5 cameras, which would mean that we are wasting most of our compute on blank inputs. So we tried to strike a compromise here and basically just do single third person, single wrist, because most of the data sets actually fit that bill. But I think if you wanted to be even more flexible in the pre-training stage, then a dense packing approach where you basically don't have any padding would be required.
Sorry if I missed this, but what's the actual output? How did we try to make it more similar?
Very good question. We discussed this over lunch too. So we're not actually making a lot of effort in making them very similar. They are very similar in the sense that we're only pre-training on single arm kind of end effector control robots. So we're not doing bimanual, we're not doing navigation yet, all of these things. It's single arm robots. But we're not making a particular effort in aligning the coordinate frames, for example, right? Like some people may define the x-axis to the right or to the left, z-axis up or down. We're not kind of taking care that all of these things are the same. This is kind of like a scalability choice. Like we think if we can do it this way, then this is much nicer because I don't actually need to look at your data super carefully and understand all the details. We haven't ablated this. So this is like, it takes probably quite a lot of effort to like go through all the data sets and like figure out exactly the coordinate transforms between them. So we haven't really tried this. I think it's worth trying whether this actually makes a difference. One thing that we did take care to align is the gripper dimension. So we felt that the gripper was like particularly neuralgic because, it's really important that the robot nails the gripper and doesn't let go of an object in the middle of moving. And a lot of the failures we saw were kind of gripper related, like early grasping or like dropping. And so we tried to make sure that all of the data sets have the same semantics for the gripper. Basically, 1 is open and 0 is closed. This is like the only thing that we actually aligned between the data sets. Everything else was kind of as it came. Okay, I will try to move on a little bit so that we can get through all of this stuff. Yeah, we try to make this easy to use. We're uploading the checkpoints to Hugging Face, so it's like a literal one-liner to load this model. It runs pretty fast. These models aren't terribly large, right? These are not billion parameter models, so they run pretty fast even on pretty old GPUs. They're also reasonably easy to fine-tune. You don't need a compute cluster to fine-tune these models. Within a few hours on a few hundred, like 100 demos or so, you can get them to fine-tune. And as I mentioned, they're kind of language and goal condition out of the box, so you can choose whether you want to condition on a language instruction or you want to condition on a goal image that your robot's supposed to follow. Usually goals work better because it's a bit of an easier task. You're kind of giving the robot a very low-level grounded target to reach rather than a kind of abstract language instruction.
When you add this new result, you take it off the page and you just send the transformer.
Yeah, you basically just put in a few new tokens, a few new positional embeddings. Yeah, and you could be smarter about this, right? You could say, oh, the new thing is an image, so I should probably like copy the weights from the images, but maybe initialize, some of them from scratch. We haven't, explored all of these things. Yeah, cool. So as I mentioned, not only the models are open source, also the full code base. Even if you don't care about the model at all, I would highly encourage you to check out the data loader for the Open Cross-Embodiment dataset if you want to work with this dataset. It took us months to build this. I think it's actually quite non-trivial to build a good data loader because you need to, take care that it's fast, it overlaps the computation with the GPUs, and it shuffles properly. I think this is a big challenge that's maybe a little bit neglected. You need to like have a large shuffle buffer and you need to be efficient enough to fit it in memory. So really, I think it makes it a lot easier if you can start with this data loader if you're planning to use this data set. And it works with JAX, it works with PyTorch. We have used it since this project for larger PyTorch projects that also do multi-node training. So I think it's a really good resource if you want to get started. Cool. I will briefly talk about the data. So I have introduced the data set before. We actually need to do a little bit of curation for this training run. So we don't train on literally everything. We kind of, as I mentioned, only train on single arm data sets. Remove any data sets that don't happen to have images or actions. And I also kind of very heuristically went in and removed data sets that I felt are too niche. So they're like single task and single environment kind of data sets. And then I even more heuristically went through and looked at the data sets, and the ones that I thought are pretty cool, I upweighted in the data mix. Right? So this is what we call the Open X magic soup, because this is kind of how it developed. Basically, I just like randomly chose things that I thought are reasonable. But this is not very scientific, right? Like this is what I want to emphasize here, basically. We just chose a mix that we thought was reasonable, but there has been no science into how to actually properly choose these mixes. And I think this is a very interesting kind of question that we should look into is like, how do we properly choose what data sets to use and at what ratios to mix them and so on. So far, it has been kind of very heuristically chosen. Cool. Briefly talking about evals. So again, we evaluate this on a bunch of different robots at Berkeley, at Stanford, and also at CMU. Try to split evals a bit into zero-shot and then fine-tuning kind of use cases. On the zero-shot side, we basically compare to RT-1X, which is the model that is in open source before, and then RT-2X on some of the tasks where we could get the numbers, which is just like a much, much larger kind of internet pre-trained model. And generally, I think across the evals, we found that Octo is better than RT-1X on many tasks, and it sometimes matches RT-2X. And so these results are a little bit to be taken with a grain of salt. Basically, RT-2X is like super powerful, trained on the internet, so it can do tasks that Octo can certainly not do, right? Like if you look at the RT-2X paper or the RT-2 paper, it did like put Coke can to Taylor Swift, right? And like Octo does not know what Taylor Swift is. So no way it can do that task. On these kind of more in-distribution tasks, I think Octo can reasonably match RT-2X performance, but then there are certain tasks where it cannot. Yeah. So this is a tricky question. They're not fully in distribution in the sense that there are some new objects, new distractors, things like this. But they're in distribution in the sense that they're still the same robot setups that we have seen in training. They're like similar, probably the same camera viewpoints. So they're in distribution to some extent, but they're not like fully the same things that we had in training. That makes sense.
For example, what's the output?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is some pushing in the dataset too. The language table dataset is fully pushing. It's basically just like a thing pushing. So it may work. I think this type of like task generalization, if you're asking a robot to do a task it has never seen in that environment, it's usually very hard. Like usually like picking up an object it has never seen in that environment, that seems like something these models can do. A fully new motion kind of thing is usually quite hard. Like even if you have seen that motion on a different robot, reproducing that motion on the current robot, if you have never seen it on the current robot, is usually a pretty hard generalization case.
For example, in the there's some point of contact where it's actually in contact with the object and it's moving. So perhaps the model would learn that. Do you think a model like this somehow generalize the moving object without living?
So yeah, I don't think these are the kind of generalizations that we really tested on, and the main reason is that they're usually the hardest and they don't really work, I would say. This kind of motion generalization is very tricky for these models because they're after all trained BC on kind of a certain range of motions, and it's probably very hard for them to completely change the way they output actions. Like kind of visual robustness type generalizations are usually much more feasible, I think, than output style generalizations. Okay. Yeah, no, they're not. Yeah, these are like we try to have higher resolution images, and so they're handheld cameras, but no, these cameras are all fixed. Okay, we tried to do the fine-tuning stuff a little bit too. So here we basically compare Octo to some like pre-trained internet representation, also trying to train from scratch. And we also evaluate on some scenarios where basically you try to have a new action space or you're trying to have a new observation fed into your action space, into your network and fine-tune with that. And generally it seemed to improve the performance somewhat. Okay. We also have quite a lot of information in our paper on what worked and what didn't. We try to be like very transparent on what we tried so that it's like easy for people to pick up. Basically, some of the maybe key items is that, as I mentioned, the diffusion decoding turned out to be quite helpful compared to some of the previous choices that people had made. Also, I wanted to, again, point out the shuffle buffer issue. For the longest time, we basically trained and it didn't seem to work very well, and it worked a lot better after we increased the size of the shuffle buffer. And so this is a bit of a detail, but basically the shuffle buffer is there to make your samples IID, right? Like basically the way that the data loading works in detail is that you pull a full episode, but you want to train on individual transitions. And so you need to have a huge, kind of buffer of these episodes so that you properly randomize between them. And so making the data loader in a way that it can actually hold 500,000 to 1 million transitions is quite critical so that these models can actually, train on properly randomized inputs. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I will try to move on a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, encoding. Yeah, we didn't find this to be particularly helpful, especially if you have temporal horizons. It can be tricky if you have these proprioceptive inputs. There can be these causal confusion cases where the model basically just learns to look at the delta between the proprio and then like copy that over to predict the action. And that's like a pretty solid strategy to roughly predict the next action. And so, but then if you roll this out on a real test case, the model will go out of distribution.
Kinematic test, right? Not dynamic.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Okay, I will run through this a little bit faster now. Basically, so key points here, we have a multi-robot control model. We made it easy to adapt. We made it easy to use. And I hope that you guys can kind of build on top of this, or at least build on top of the data loader if you just want to load the data set. I think it is quite useful. Cool. So to summarize where we are right now, basically we have talked about data. We have talked about our first modeling effort. Are we done, right? Like, do we have robotics foundation models now? Probably not quite. And so the usual failure case that we will encounter is somewhat visualized by this picture. And I stole this from one of Chelsea's talks that I looked at a while ago, basically trying to visualize what our current robot data sets look like, right? And they really look like islands in a big ocean. So basically you have some of these data sets, we put them all together, right? Like fractal data set, QT-opt, whatever, but they're all quite insular, right? Like they're on their particular robot in their particular lab setting that they collected in, on the particular like 3-5 tasks that they care about. But there's a lot of ocean in the middle, right? And chances are, if you take this model and you try to deploy it in some task, very likely your task will end up somewhere in the ocean, right? Like very likely it will not look like any of the training tasks that we have, collected data on. And this is a problem because it means very likely you will not actually benefit a whole lot from the pre-training if you're in the far ocean, far away from any of the data sources. Okay, so what we really need kind of qualitatively from a data set is to look less like islands and look a little bit more like a big landmass, basically a lot of support. And so this is a project that was recently completed that I'm quite excited about. It is another dataset project, but quite different in style. It's called the Droid project. We try to collect a lot of super diverse data. And I think there were some folks of you guys also involved in this project. So I hope I'm not boring you with this presentation. But basically the key facts are we took the robots out. We took them to many, many different buildings, many scenes, many people involved again, lots of tasks. And try to get a really diverse kind of coverage on data, right? So not insular data sets, but like a very broad distribution of data. This project was co-led by Sasha Kuznetsky, one of Chelsea's PhD students who really spearheaded this effort. He built basically all the robot hardware platform. He started all the data collection efforts. So really big shout out to him here. And this data set is really cool. I think it's a very nice resource, lots of diversity. If you just look at these videos, basically you will understand it's a lot more diverse than any of the robot learning data sets that we had before. It's all collected on this identical platform. There's at least one here at Penn, I believe. So you guys have access to that too. We have, lots of diversity in this data set. Many scenes, tasks, viewpoints, also rich annotations. So it's not just, a single camera, but it's calibrated multi-view. For those of you who collected data, you know how painful it is to calibrate. We have language annotations on the data, and we have everything open source. So the data set, the robot hardware, and also the policy learning code to go with it. And basically, yeah, we also have a visualizer for the whole thing. So if you're interested yourself and trying to look at some of these data samples and understanding what is actually in the data set, I encourage you to check that out. And you can filter by certain categories like objects, scenes, and tasks, and so on. Yeah, but I think the key difference in this data set is really its diversity. It is interoperable with the previously introduced data sets, so same format. You can just drop it in. And as I mentioned, diversity is really key here. So we also analyze the kind of verbs and objects, and you can see that these plots look similar to the ones we had before. But the key point here is that it's really much more diverse in the types of scenes that we have looked at, right? Like these robots were out. We basically took them, brought them to people's homes, brought them into Airbnbs and so on to get a really diverse scene distribution. And so you can see that the distribution of scenes we have in Droid is a lot more diverse than any of the existing data sets. And I think this is really the kind of the key benefit of using this type of data, that it doesn't look like a few islands in their individual scenes, but it looks more like a very broad coverage, coherent data set. We tried to evaluate this time only on a single robot platform because it was all collected on this one platform, but on a bunch of different tasks, including some this is Sasha's kitchen. It can also do some lentil cooking in Sasha's kitchen. And we evaluate this in a co-training setting. So basically you have a few demonstrations in the target task. You co-train that with all of Droid, so a lot of data, and then you evaluate its kind of robustness to, say, for example, different distractors in the scene and so on. And we found that it helped there. To be very honest here, I don't think this is the final result that we were hoping for. Like we were actually hoping to get a policy that can, work in a new scene. I think this is the kind of goal. We basically want to train one policy, and then it should work on the UPenn Droid robot, and it should work on the USC Droid robot, and so on. USC doesn't have one. Okay, the Berkeley Droid robot. So this is kind of the goal that we're going towards. The most naive thing, just like, throw the Octo model at this data set, did not work. So this is kind of very much still an ongoing investigation, trying to figure out how can we actually train policies that work well on this data set and that actually work zero shot. These were actually diffusion policy models. They were kind of like in the policy learning department of this project. There were two concurrent streams, one that tried co-training with diffusion policies, and one that tried like foundation model training with Octo. And basically that didn't quite work yet. So we're still working. I want to make this point that I think there's different types of generalization that we may want to see from these types of foundational models. Right? You could imagine you would just want to see it generalized to a new scene, but on a known robot and a known task. Right? That's like one level of generalization. You can imagine you want to actually do new tasks, but still on the same robot, or you want to do a completely new robot out of the box. That seems very hard. And so I think they're kind of sorted in the hardness, but in my mind, they're also sorted in importance. I really think that this new scene generalization thing is really, really important to nail first. Right? Because by definition, if you build a model that cannot work in a new scene, then nobody but you will be able to use it. Right? So it's really, really important to nail the scene diversity and scene generalization aspect first, and then we can worry about new tasks and new robots and so on. But I think this is really a key point that I want to make here, is that the scene and maybe also the task generalization is something that we can address with this Droid dataset because it has many scenes and many tasks. All right. I will try to wrap this up now. Basically today, I mostly focused on datasets and models, which I think are two critical kind of pieces that we need to make this paradigm shift in robotics happen, where we go towards more foundational models that are trained on many tasks. I've introduced a few projects we have done in this direction, Open X and Droid on the dataset side, the RT-X models and Octo on the model side. I think there's lots more research to be done here. One thing that I didn't talk about much today is hardware. I think there's lots of exciting developments in hardware that I haven't personally worked on, but I think they're very important. People from Chelsea's lab have worked on the Mobile Aloha platform, which is like a really affordable mobile manipulation platform. There's other great work from Cheng, that's in Sharon's lab, where they have worked on these super cool teleoperation devices that will make teleoperation and data collection much easier. So I think there's a lot of kind of hand-in-hand improvements on the hardware side towards the data collection side, which are really important. And then one other key point that I want to really emphasize is the evaluation side. I hopefully have made it clear that we had quite a lot of pain in evaluating these policies and like going to all the different labs and like, running these policies in the real world takes forever. And so I think really looking into how to improve evaluations and how to make it more scalable and how can they keep track with the improving capabilities of these models is a really key problem that I think we need to worry about. I have a one-slide teaser on this because we are working on a project that we're hoping to release soon. This was work done by Xuanlin, Jiayun, and Karl at Stanford and UCSD. And basically, we looked into how can we scale model evaluation using simulation. So basically trying to build simulations that are kind of real enough that a policy trained on our real data sets that I have introduced will meaningfully work in these environments. And so basically we went ahead and we made simulated versions of these environments that look, not quite real, but they are looking quite similar. And so the pipeline we're imagining here is basically you train on all of these real data sets, then you do most of your evaluation and improvement cycles in the simulation. And then eventually at the very end, when you want to actually show people their works, you need to do a real evaluation. There's no way around that. But a key performance metric here is basically that you want to make sure that the performance in simulation is heavily correlated with the performance in real, right? This is the key metric. If your simulator is correlated, then you can improve on the simulator and you can have some confidence it will actually work in real. And so basically what we did as part of this project is that we actually evaluated a lot of these policies, a lot of these models trained on different data sets in our simulators and established some sort of correlation between the real and the simulated evaluation. And so this is a project that we're hoping to release soon, which I think will make the evaluation a little bit less painful. But I think there's lots more work to be done to make these tools, more scalable, actually look better, work better, more robust. I think this is like a big improvement direction for future research. Cool. I think with that, I will finish since we're nearly out of time. I think there's lots of other stuff to do also on the data side, like you can integrate other data sources that are not robotic. And I think that's kind of the direction that we're working on towards now. really trying to nail the thing to a point where we can actually get zero-shot generalization on Droid setups to new scenes. I think that would be the goal. Cool. Thanks a lot for having me. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Versus, I think I understand that Droid for training to do, but by adding like the part of RTX and Droid together.
Oh no, sorry. Co-training means we basically took a few in-domain demonstrations for the particular task I showed, and then 50-50 split the batches between those and all of Droid. We did not try to like the other kind of comparison we have in the paper that I didn't show here is to have the in-domain demonstrations and Open X. And basically adding Droid instead of Open X helped more. We didn't really try putting both of them there. I think that would be also a reasonable next step. It would be, yeah. So I think the existing Droid existing Open X dataset doesn't have too much diversity on the Franca side. So I think it really meaningfully changes. But not only Franca, it basically doubles the number of scenes in the Open X dataset. So I think it's a qualitatively different resource.
My other question is, do you feel like we need to be more careful about like what we actually personally cut into? Like, for example, do you think it would help if we have some sort of 3D reconstruction of it for the objects or camera position? Because I know in the RTX there's some data, some subpart has a camera, some doesn't.
Yeah. So I think it definitely makes sense to collect as much information as we're collecting these robot data as we can. Right? Like it's basically free at that point, right? You just need to spend the effort to make sure that your data set, that your sensory suite has all the recordings. But there's no reason not to collect a certain type of data, right? Like in Droid, we had like multiple stereo cameras, we had them calibrated. So we have really a lot of information collected with that data. And if we go to the lengths of actually collecting these data sets, it seems like a very worthy investment. Now, I still think it is good to have models that are somewhat flexible in these choices, because very, very likely not everybody will agree on what actually constitutes a reasonable effort and what constitutes an important sensor to collect, right? Like some people may say, oh, but like, why didn't you put like tactile pads onto your fingers, right? Like I want tactile information and we just didn't collect that. So I think having models that can be flexible, yet trying to maximize the kind of data that you actually collect while you collect it, I think that seems like a reasonable strategy. One thing, for example, that we didn't do in Droid, but that I feel now we should have done, is to use fisheye lenses on the wrist camera. So Cheng, I showed his like manipulation things, really emphasized that fisheye lenses can be very helpful because they much broaden your field of view. And worst case, if you don't like it, you can still crop in to get the same kind of non-fisheye view later. So there's really no downside to doing it. It's just maybe a cost question. But I feel we should have probably done it in hindsight. Yeah.
You spoke rightly, I think, about how scene generalization seems like the lowest benchmark is really neat. And it seems like also robotics is so far behind like vision. Scene generalization in particular, that we have models that work so well, and vision really could be like we should be borrowing as much as we can from vision foundation models to get robots to work in new instances, new slightly different distracted objects, etc. And even if we don't go kind of full RT2 and say take some like huge vision language model and use that as a starting point for building a robotic system. There are so many other things we could be doing. Maybe we could do segmentation or something as a starting point for that presentation.
I know why you asked this question.
Yeah. What are your why is this not yet next year direction? And you feel like there are merits in doing this?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really just like somehow we haven't figured it out in the Octo model, but I definitely feel we should be using these pre-trained models somehow. They seem very valuable because of the breadth of training data that they have seen. With regards to how we exactly incorporate that stuff, I think I would be more happy if the solution was something that looks more like an end-to-end model, where you basically can ride the wave of improved vision models, but at the same time kind of cleanly interface with the robotics data sets and just like throw them in the mix. Kind of a more, let's say, handcrafted approach where we like, okay, we freeze SAM and we like find all the objects, and then we freeze clip and we find all the features, and then we feed it into our model. It seems like you will lose something, right? Like you may lose some information that's not in the objects but important for the task, or some intra-object information that you don't get without the background. So I think that feels to me more like a kind of short-term exploitation kind of strategy, but like the long-term thing should definitely have a way of incorporating non-robot data, right? Like it's crazy to not incorporate it. So yeah.
Do you think that at some point you could generalize some video of the human grasping objects?
The holy grail of robotics is generalizing from videos of humans. Yeah, I think we're hoping that it will work. I have worked on human data a long time at Google when I was there as a student researcher, and it hasn't worked, and we haven't published anything on it. I have more hope that it will work now. The reason is that we have more diverse robot data. So basically, if you think about it, right, there's like the distribution of robot data, the distribution of human data, and we're trying to get transfer. And if they look like these islands and they're like super far apart from each other, then it may be very hard to get transfer. But if we have more diverse robot data and more robot embodiments, like 22 embodiments in this data set alone, then maybe adding the human data as yet another embodiment is easier to get transfer from. So I would hope that yes, eventually we would be able to leverage these human data sets, and we are trying to see whether we can get this to work. But it is a very hard problem. And I think many PhD students have tried and not really worked at scale so far. But I think it's like the leverage seems enormous, right? Like once we can learn from human video, we can get a lot more data to actually fuel the pipeline. So it seems like a very important thing to work on.
To say one observation on that, that in the ego for data, 75% of the human data are that's one.
Mobile aloha, we're getting to. Yeah. I think there's also many other questions, like do we actually want to train a lot of Ego4D stuff? It's a bit unclear. Like there's a lot of stuff that's probably not very tied to the task that we actually care about as roboticists, at least at the moment. Yeah, I think many open questions, but definitely something that's important to figure out.
Thank you very much, Karl. This is the most educating talk about robot learning.
Nice.
I mean, we shaped us reading like probably about 50 papers.
Very good, very good.
I really appreciate that. Very proud of all the work. Karl was here visiting.
I mentioned in the beginning, we were not here yet.
So I have a question about state. So in general, I mean, when you were here for a very long time, we were holding some kind of state inside the system, and we would use it for prediction. Prediction was really a very powerful loss, right? Where is all that gone?
Okay, when I was in this lab, in your lab, I literally worked on video prediction. I think back then the models were somewhat, not super capable. Like we worked on like 1D rotation kind of problems, I think. I think nowadays the models look a lot more capable.
Yeah, but independent of video, like there is no state here, right? That it has, you keep some kind of transition and dynamic.
I mean, it technically implicitly has that, right? Like it's a transformer model. It sees multiple observations in sequence. So somewhere in that transformer, probably it builds a representation of state and dynamics, but on short horizons.
Yeah, so you are passing a window always. Right?
Yeah. So it's a lot less, defined and interpretable than like a classic state in robotics.
But between the two windows, what happens?
It's a sliding window, right? It's a sliding window, but it's a very short window. Like for Octo, we use one step of history. So it's a very short window.
This is associated also that these are all stop and go learning.
The tasks, you mean, they're not very dynamic. Yes.
They're not very dynamic.
Yes, I would assume that if your task required.
You cannot do a pouring, right? Do you have any pouring here?
We don't have pouring here. I would think you can probably. Okay, I mean, I will not claim, but I would assume that pouring is maybe in the reach. I think Cheng, in his paper, he cares a lot more about these dynamic tasks, and I think he had like some tossing task. That seems like fairly hard. And I think then, or I think there was some paper on using transformers for locomotion. Ilya from Berkeley worked on this. And I think he found having much longer horizons actually helped him quite a bit. But then there were some other technical tricks to actually make the policies work when they have long horizons. But I don't think like a end-to-end transformer backbone is at odds with having dynamics somewhere encoded in the model. It's just not as explicit. And right now, these models arguably don't have a whole lot of dynamics because they don't have a lot of history and the tasks are not very dynamic.
And one more thing, I mean, in terms of learning from humans, I like very much Cheng's, and this idea was around for quite a while. I mean, in terms of evolution and design and learning affordances, it's always completely different affordance to use a hand versus to use a tool gripper versus to use a pneumatic, right? So transferring from using a hand to 2 fingers, I think is really a very machine learning oriented task rather than like a biological thing. Or something I mean, doesn't have, if we talk about affordances, and if we really talk that we want to learn like task specific, it should not work.
So yeah, I guess then it becomes a question of where do you draw the level of abstraction that you want to learn from humans, right? Like you can still learn that in order to make a tea, you need to like grasp the water heater thing, or you need to like grasp the mug in order to make tea, but you don't necessarily understand where exactly or how you need to approach it with your morphology, right? So I think at some level of abstraction, there is still a lot of transfer possible, but the morphology dictates how low you can go in that abstraction. And there is definitely, a lot of push in the community towards making morphologies that are closer to humans, right? Like a lot of people work on humanoids, they work on articulate hands. So maybe that problem kind of solves itself, or like it becomes easier over time. But I think even for like parallel jaw grippers, I think there's a lot of things that we could learn from human video about how to solve certain tasks. Just it wouldn't be at the very lowest level of kind of abstraction of like literally how do I need to move the fingers. Yeah. Cool. We're probably at time, but thanks a lot, guys. This was fun.